Okay, this is David Zieler, Director of the Caltech Heritage Project. It is Wednesday, February 1st, 2023. It is great to be back with Dr. Ashish Mahabal. Ashish, it's great to be with you again. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Happy to be here again.
In our first conversation, Ashish, we did a great tour of your approach to the big questions in astronomy and machine learning. Today, let's take it all the way back to the beginning, learn about your family background in India. Let's start first with your parents. Tell me about them and where they're from.
So my parents are from a small place called Yavatma, that is not far from the center of India, the geographic center, north, south, and east, west. So far, far away from the oceans and any big hills or mountains.
What were their professions when you were a kid?
So my father worked with an insurance company, the Life Insurance Company of India, and my mother was a housewife as I grew up. And he continued in that company until he retired.
What languages were spoken in your household?
So the mother tongue is Marathi, the same as the state of Maharashtra. But my dad was good in English, and my mom could also speak English, and Hindi is also commonly spoken. So I would say Marathi was the most commonly used language, but English was understood and Hindi was also understood.
Was religion a big deal in your household growing up?
Well, my parents were religious, definitely. And so because of that, initially I was also inculcated into the religious practices and so on until I learned about astronomy and the bigger world.
And this would be Hinduism that your parents were part of?
Yes, my parents practiced Hinduism, that's right. Yeah.
Was there anybody in your family that was interested in science that you might have grabbed onto when you were a kid?
Oh, so my father was definitely interested in science. So the religion in India works rather differently from religion here. So most Indians, so for instance, unlike in Christianity, the Hindu universe was not created 6,000 years ago. So it was created long, long back. There are even cycles and epicycles, maybe. And so what that means is that most Hindus don't have any problem with evolution. Not just that, the avatars of the one of the main gods of Trinity, Vishnu. So the various avatars, they also equated to evolution, how the initial avatars were in the water and then they come out of water, and the later avatars have been human forms. And so something like evolution is quite well ingrained in some sense, but also a lot of scientific methodology and techniques. I think that is where they generally don't have issues with. I don't know how to put it. So many engineers, for instance, are very good in their handling of science during work hours, and they can go home and become a bit superstitious. But they're all scientific minded if you corner them correctly and talk to them about it and so on.
What kinds of schools did you go to growing up?
So my father had a transferable job. What that meant is that when he had a transfer, then he would move, and with him, we would move. And so I went to many different schools, and all of them were English medium schools. So, in fact, English was my first language, and Marathi and Hindi were both secondary languages as I grew up. So, all my science education happened in English. So, we went to various cities. I for the first year, few years of my life, I was in Yavatma, the same place where my parents were born and I was born, and then we moved to first we moved to well, seventh and eighth was in Parbhani, a town that was a few hundred kilometers away, and then to Chandrapur, and then to Nagpur. In between, I came back to Yatma for a couple of years also. So these are the four places where my much of my education took place.
And were you always interested in math and science? Was that always your favorite subjects in schools?
I got interested fairly early on. It wasn't too difficult to handle that, and I got very good teachers. So the teachers uh, were very patient. They would describe various things. And many times I remember I used to have questions that were not directly in the books. And if the teachers didn't know the answers, they were good enough to go to the library with me, find out other books where we could look those up and describe those to me. So I think my teachers as well as my parents had a big role in uh, ensuring that I continue in science and mathematics.
What about astronomy specifically? Did you look up at the sky? Did you see the stars and wonder?
Yes, we did. So, in fact, my father knew the constellations, and the place I grew up in, Yavatmal, has very, or used to have, dark skies. So, especially during summer when we would be outside walking, and sometimes he would put me on his shoulders when I was really small and point to constellations, and especially things like Orion and the Ursa Major and the areas through which the planets pass, etc. And sometimes even connect those to mythology because there are mythological stories, but also astronomy itself. And so that is where my initial astronomy really started. And then when I was in ninth grade, that is when Halley's Comet came around.
Mm.
And at the time, my father bought me a small telescope, a 2-inch telescope. And being able to spot the comet through that, though it was like a cottony ball, and showing it to our neighbors, and then my schoolmates would come home to watch it and so on. So it was thrilling that we could spot it, that it was far away, it was visiting after several decades, and that others get thrilled as well when I can show it to them. I think that really was a big boost in me thinking, oh, this looks like a great field. I didn't think in those terms, of course, that this looks like a great field or whatever, but that is where the interest continued. And in fact, a few years later, then my father bought me a bigger telescope, a 5-inch telescope. The first one was a very simple mount, whereas the second one was equatorial mount, meaning in principle it could be connected to a motor and then we could track it to so that it would stay on a given object. I didn't go and build any motor and so on, so I was not that industrious in terms of that. But because it was a bigger telescope, what we could do is that we could look at more details of many bodies. So not only planets, but trying to look at some of the Messier objects, etc. And then again, that meant that more people were interested in seeing those as well. Of course, it was a bit heavier, so carrying it away from home was a bit of a problem, but we used to manage that every now and then.
Ashish, what about computers? Were you interested in computers and what they could do when you were growing up?
So the first computer that I touched, I think it was when I was in 11th grade, if I'm right. So for the first several years of my life, I had not even touched a computer. And so this was not in my school or in my college, but one of my earlier classmates went to an engineering college, and their college had this computer. So I would to sneak in with him in his lab. And then we learned various things like Logo and Basic and then C, and it was fun. So I got hooked on immediately to it, and so we would have fun solving some very simple problems, test examples, and so on. So definitely.
When it was time to think about colleges, what was available to you? What did you want to pursue?
So again, everyone has heard of IITs, even here now. Everyone, well, most people. And again, until I got to my 11th grade, I had not even heard of IITs. So when I heard in 11th that, oh, one can give IIT entrance exams, and we prepared for it a little bit, but I couldn't get in at that time because there was not really time to prepare for that when I heard. So my long sight was really the nearby city of Nagpur, so not really far off, and that's where I went and did my bachelor's and then my master's. So by that time, of course, I knew of other places, but my parents were staying there and the university there was fine. So I ended up doing both bachelor's and master's in Nagpur, not too far from Yavatmal.
And is college in India, is it like the British system where you declare a major or a focus right away?
So there are different things in there. There are the bachelor's in science and commerce and arts, which are 3-year bachelors, and engineering, there are 4-year bachelors. And in both, there are ways in which you can maneuver a little bit. But the college that I went to for bachelor's, it did not have a major, in fact. So it had 3 subjects which were taught at equal strength or equal depth. So, in fact, my bachelor's is in electronics and physics and mathematics because we had multiple papers of each of these subjects. And that was in a way good because that gave us a very good grounding in all three subjects. Sometimes the syllabus used to be topsy-turvy a little bit in the sense that the first year you would learn about applications and learn the basics in the second year. So what the applications were based on, etc. And that happened a little bit, especially in mathematics to us.
When did you start to think that you might apply for graduate school and pursue a career in science?
So as I said, I was interested in astronomy early on. And we even had an amateur astronomy club that we had formed when I was in bachelor's, so with a few other friends. Kutuhal, and that group loosely exists even now. And then the Nagpur University, it did not have astronomy courses. It did have a possibility of starting a theoretical physics course, which comes as close to astronomy as you can get without an observational thing. And the requirement for the course was that 6 students are required and a willing teacher. There was a willing teacher, so he was very interested in teaching, and so he knew his subject quite well. And we managed to get 4 students but not 6, so we couldn't start the course. So I ended up learning a lot of quantum mechanics and electronics during my masters and some solid state physics. But at that time, astronomy, I continued to think about astronomy. And then when I was in the first year, there was an opportunity to go to a summer school in Pune, where a new institute had been found, the Inter-University Center for Astronomy and Astrophysics. And so they, together with the National Center for Radio Astrophysics, which is the radio arm of Tata Institute of Fundamental Research, they were holding a summer school, and there were posters out for that. And so I decided to apply for that.
What was interesting to you about that? What opportunities might that have opened up?
So there I would have met, and I did go to that. I did meet various lecturers from different places in astronomy because it was mainly the NCRA and IUCA people who taught there, but there were a few others too. But also more like-minded students, students of my age who were thinking of getting into something similar, whom I would have met, and that did happen. I formed some friendships at that time. I'm still in contact with many people from that time.
And this was just for one summer? Did you return for additional summers?
So this was just for one summer, but that got me introduced to several people. So what happened after that is that next year there was the visiting students program, which was a more focused program rather than something like a summer school where it was mostly lectures and a small project. So I went back to the visiting students program. And it's a fairly complicated but interesting story because during the visiting students program, though it's around the same time that the entrance exams for graduate students for the next year were happening. So people who were 1 year senior to uh, what we were at that time. And so because we were there and we had been selected from a large number of applications, we were also asked to give that exams. And we did. It was not for any selection or any such process, but we anyway went ahead and gave that and didn't think about it. And then 2/3 way through my visiting students program, in fact, I fell seriously ill and I couldn't complete the program. So I had to go back. And then I wrote back to them that I couldn't complete it at that time. So can I come back and complete the remaining work? And they were very good and they agreed to that. So during Diwali, which was a few months after summer, I went back and completed the project. But at that time, after that, my sickness came back actually. So what had happened is that I had nephrotic syndrome, which means that the structure of nephrons in my kidneys had changed. And that led to a lot of water getting out of my cells and a lot of swelling around my knees and so on. And in fact, when I gave my master's exams, it was in that state that I really gave my exams. So couldn't, it wasn't very happy state. And then I had to go through a biopsy and I was on steroids for several months. I didn't eat any salt for 8 months, for instance. This was quite a time of my life. And then things got better. And then I was weaned off of steroids and I was fine. But what that meant is that I had missed all the entrance exams for all graduate schools because it is around that those happen. So I was considering even alternate occupations, and that is because I was already with my girlfriend at the time, who's now my wife of a few decades. And so we're wondering, okay, maybe we should settle down. And if I cannot get into grad school, and if it's going to take 1 more year before I get into grad school, and then several years before I get a PhD, and rather than that, there are many other opportunities. Why don't we do that? And so on. So I was thinking on those lines too. And then suddenly I get a telegram. There was such a thing as telegram still at that time. This is 1992 or so, from the director of Ayuka, that the grad school is starting, and based on the exam that I had given 1 year earlier, they would be happy to invite me to grad school. So it was completely out of the blue. I hadn't even thought of that. And so, of course, took it and went to Ayuka.
Ashish, were you thinking before this opportunity came about that you might have to leave science entirely?
Well, at least to start with for the time, right? Meaning I hadn't really thought of long term, but to get going and get on my own, yes, that was a possibility.
Had you known about Ayuka before?
Oh yeah, so Ayuka is where I went both for the summer school and the visiting students program. And in fact, the way I went to Ayuka first was also interesting. So in Nagpur, where I went to my bachelor's, there were a couple of people who had some good influence on me. Someone called Vivek Wag. So he used to teach math, and then he was only a few years older than I am. And then he and some of our friends, we would organize some club activities like discussing various physics related things, math related things. And his older brother was an astronomer, astrophysicist. And so he knew about Ayuka. He was a postdoc there at the time. And so he had told me about it. And so I was just visiting Pune for some other reason, visiting some family members. And I decided to just go to Ayuka on my own. I didn't know anyone in person there at the time because this other person said that he was also in Nagpur. And I went up and met one of the secretaries there. And the secretary, Chella, he dutifully wrote down my address and name. And when the summer school was decided, I actually got a poster at home that Ayuka is having the summer school and maybe you want to apply or whatever. And that's how that association really began. So yes, I went to summer school. I went to visiting students program. Then I got invited to go to grad school, and that's where I ended up doing my graduation. And now I'm an adjunct faculty of Ayuka.
Oh,
So.
wow. What areas in astronomy is Ayuka particularly strong in?
So I love various things related to transients and classification now, but when I started, it was very different. So I was interested in observational astronomy because of my amateur astronomy background too. But as you get deeper and deeper into that, you can start seeing various connections and how theory plays an important role, how many unknowns that are there, and so on. But observational astronomy was very much the main area I was interested in. But over the course of last few decades, I have touched many, many different parts of astronomy and dabbled here and there a lot. But one of the main things that has stayed is the mathematical and computational connections of all these. So machine learning is something I do extensively, and I have applied machine learning related techniques to gravitational wave data, to neutron stars related things, TDs and supernovae and asteroids and yeah, touching all kinds of different things. So that's really something that I would say that use being able to use the large data, being able to ask the data questions that may not have been asked before, and exploring what may be out there, including anomalies, subclasses, etc. That's where I've been going a lot recently.
Ashish, as a grad student in India, I wonder if you can explain the funding structure for astronomy. How is astronomical research supported in India?
Right. So there are not too many universities where astronomy takes place. It's been growing. It was a much smaller number when I was growing up. And so what we had to do is that we had to give an exam called the JRF, the Junior Research Fellow exam. So this is a central exam that happens. And if you pass that exam, then it allows you to do two things. It's like a certificate to teach later, because teachers also need that, but it also gives you a stipend while you are doing your PhD. So after I joined for my PhD, the stipend that I got was 1800 rupees. In If you do the conversion of 1800 rupees to today's dollar amount, it's something like 80 rupees is to a dollar. So I would get something like $25, $25 a month. By today's standards, it was very different at that time, of course. But so within that 1800 rupees, we could rent a place of 600 rupees, and then there would be discounted food that was available at Ayuka and so on. And then there used to be a little bit of money we would get to buy books. So one could just about persist on that, doing not much more than whatever.
What kind of opportunities did you have with instrumentation or observational projects in grad school?
Right. So at that time, Ayuka did not have its own telescope, and there were two or three telescopes, optical telescopes in India. Ayuka was from the central body called UGC, University Grants Commission. And because it was an inter-university center, one of the things that Ayuka was involved in is connecting with other universities. So there used to be visitors all the time from other universities, and there used to be opportunities to go and visit other universities. And we could also apply for telescope time to the telescopes in India and abroad. And within India, it was a fairly straightforward thing to be able to visit. So I used to go to the Kavlur Observatory, which is not far from Bangalore. That is where my initiation into observational astronomy took place. And then if there were projects that came along where you could apply to foreign telescopes, you would do that. And then one would have to write to a couple of central government agencies to see if they would fund your project. So Ayuka would have some money, but they would encourage us and our advisors, meaning just students writing may not work well, but with the help of the advisor, then the student would apply to these agencies. And sometimes one agency would give a few thousand rupees and another agency would give a few thousand rupees. And combining those together, that is when you could then go outside. So, in fact, I did visit South Africa for observations when I was doing a PhD. I went to Australia for a conference when I was doing a PhD. And then I did go to, in fact, the visit to South Africa was when I was trying to observe a set of spiral galaxies, and I tried observing. There is a class of objects called Cersei Pastoriza galaxies. These are spiral galaxies with hotspots, and that is the topic on which I had decided to do my thesis. And in trying to observe that, I went to South Africa. I went to Kitt Peak in the US also, and then
Was
I
that your
went to
first time in the United States?
yes, it was. Yeah, it was fun. And uh, I also went to a couple of telescopes in India. And at all these places, I couldn't get any good data. It was as if the universe was trying to tell me something. Don't observe these spiral galaxies, right?
I wonder
And
if you
then,
can explain the difference. What is good data? What is bad data?
right, so if you have clouds, optical data is not going to be good. In fact, in most cases, you are not even allowed to open the telescope. So the observatories that I went to in India, Kaulur Observatory, Nainital Observatory, they are normally fully staffed. What that means is that you have night assistants with you who do all the operations. You have to tell them where to point the telescopes, and they point this from 25 years ago that I'm talking of, 30 years ago that I'm talking about. Things have changed a little bit. There are even some automated telescopes now. But so they would do the observations, and they would do the pointing, and you would look at the data and so on. And Kavlur was the Kitt Peak was the first observatory where I get to the telescope. Someone comes with me, shows me the telescope, and hands me the keys and says, "Okay, the dome is yours." Yeah. I say, "What do you mean?" And so then they described what we can do and so on. And then it's foggy, so I cannot open the dome. And then later on, it clears a bit. So I start opening the dome, and they've given me a radio set on which there is two-way communication. And immediately the radio cracker says, "Don't open the dome. It's clear, but it's still not, it's still a lot humid out there." So I had to close the dome. I couldn't get any observations at Kitt Peak. The site was beautiful. It was really nice monsoon and so on. But no data. So that is what happened at the time. Sorry, what was your question? Just
The question was, well, let's see, we got off track now. We were talking about, well, I can go to my next question. We could return, and that is how you got interested in spiral galaxies. What were some of the big questions in spiral galaxies?
right. So that is a particular type of galaxy, the Cepheids galaxies, that one of my early mentors, Tushar Prabhu, had studied, and he had studied them using photographic plates. And one of the questions that was being asked there was about star formation histories of those galaxies, because in spiral galaxies you have many kinds of stars, but in these particular galaxies there are some specific regions where there are many young stars that one can see, and trying to understand those populations. And I hadn't done any research of my own before, so it looked like a good problem to start. And I said, right on. But then when we could not start after going to so many telescopes, and I mentioned that there were many university visitors who would come to Ayuka. Ayuka also used to have many international meetings. And so that is how I got introduced to Patrick McCarthy, who's also, or used to be from Pasadena, from the Carnegie Institute of Washington at the time, Carnegie Observatories now. And my PhD advisor, Ajit Kimbhavi, he knew him well. And then we started talking, and we decided, instead of spiral, why don't we go to the other kind of galaxy? Maybe we should have a project on elliptical galaxies. And Pat was working on a sample of bright radio galaxies, one Jansky sources, originally selected from the Molonglo radio catalog. Molonglo is a place in Australia, so it was a southern sample. What that meant is that if we wanted to follow up these objects, then they will have to be observed from the southern hemisphere. And then we obtained time in Chile. So Las Campanas is where the observatory has time. So Carnegie Institute owns that telescope in Chile. And so with Patrick, I went to Chile, and there 15 nights, not a single cloud seen. So lots of good data. So half my PhD data was obtained at that time. And then 1 year later, we went back a second time, again, several days, no clouds, and remaining PhD data obtained. So those are the two runs on which I could analyze that fully and write my thesis on that.
Who was your thesis advisor?
Professor Ajit Kimbhavi.
And what was your advisor's specialty?
So he came from TIFR, and he had done lots of different things. So observational astronomy, he was one of the few people at IUCA who was doing it at that time. There was a few others also. He was also interested in theory. He had done a few things in black holes. But in general, he was very interested in forward-looking things. So computation was an area that he was also interested in. So he, in fact, went on to found the Virtual Observatory India later on. He went on to become the director of IUCA. He's still a professor emeritus there. But he got me interested in observational astronomy, and he had these very good connections with several other observatories. And meaning it was with him that I talked to Tushar Prabhu first about the Cepheids galaxies, and then with Patrick McCarthy about the elliptical galaxies. So he was a good support in the different things that I ended up doing.
What would you say the main conclusions or contributions of your thesis research was?
So the thesis research, what we did at the time was these radio galaxies, the bright radio galaxies, are typically at the centers of large clusters. So they are ellipticals. And because they're radio, they often have a disk in them and a radio jet in them. So the main study that I was doing was using optical and infrared data to look at relationship between possible dust lanes in these galaxies with the larger radio structure and in general the morphology of the galaxies. So, though that was the main thing, what ended up happening is that I also went deeper into what morphology means, applying mathematical techniques to understand how we can compute various things related to morphology. And so there were some offshoots related to that from my thesis. So I was able to show the relationship between dust lanes and these larger radio structures, but also dwell a bit into these mathematical techniques.
Would you say that even in graduate school with your thesis research, you were starting to appreciate the impact of computation and maybe even machine learning in the research?
Not so much machine learning, but definitely computation. I was very interested in different algorithms, understanding how you could automate things. To that extent, machine learning, yes, but not in the same sense as it is used today in terms of supervised or unsupervised, but automating. So I was very interested in automating. I was very interested in different languages and trying to bring techniques that may not have been used before into astronomy. So many mathematical techniques.
If you look back at your thesis today, what would need to be updated? What has stood the test of time?
Well, I think the techniques are still all right, but what may be done better is now there are so many different wavelengths that we have data from, and combining them together would be an interesting endeavor. So much more is known. Also, the imaging resolution has improved. Even in radio, we have got so many wavelengths. And now the most critical thing, I think, is the temporal stream. So we have observations for the same objects at so many different epochs, and that makes a big difference because we understand the variability of these objects. So when it comes to galaxies, we don't have good enough resolutions to understand of the individual stars, but we can see how the centers of these galaxies are varying as a function of time if they are active galactic nuclei. And these are Vanjansky sources, so all of them would be very active in that sense.
When you defended, what were your opportunities at that point? Did you specifically want to come to the United States?
No, I didn't specifically want to come here. I did apply to a few places here, and I applied to a few places in India after I defended. And in fact, what happened was that there was a good chance that so when I went the second time, I think it was to Chile, I on both times I'd gone through Pasadena, and I'd so there's an interesting connection there. So George Orgosky, he had visited Ayuka during one of the international meetings there. He and a few others, I had taken them on a trip. They wanted to go visit some nearby places, and I had accompanied them as their local guide. And so at the time, I had some very good conversations with all these professors visiting from the US. And then when I was visiting Chile and passing through Pasadena, I had let George know that I'm going to be giving a talk at Carnegie Institute. And then he was good to come and listen to the talk, and he liked the talk. And then we kept on talking about that. And when then I knew that an opportunity to work with him was going to come up. And so the first postdoc that I did in India was at Physical Research Laboratory. But at that time already, that announcement, the advertisement had come up. So I applied to work with him. And then there were a few other applications, of course. And then I got selected through that process. And then, so after my PhD, I spent about 14 months in Ahmedabad doing my first postdoc, and then came over to Caltech then.
For the first postdoc, were you mostly focused on continuing in your thesis research, or did you take on new work?
So there was some new work because a physical research laboratory has its own observatory, the Mount Abu Observatory, and what I had proposed to do there were additional observations. So also elliptical galaxies, but not just the radio ellipticals that I had worked on earlier. And I was doing some kinds of things that I had done during my thesis work, but also extending out a little bit in related directions from there.
Now, had you known about Caltech, its reputation in the field? Was that one of the reasons you applied here?
Absolutely. So I did not know too much when I was growing up, and it was only after I started working at Ayuka that I got the details about all of this. So it's interesting that I have known about scientists for a long time and their work, but I have never paid too much attention to where they are from.
Hmm.
So associating them, for instance, I knew about Feynman, but not that Feynman was at Caltech.
Uh-huh.
So,
What about
so
Chandrasekhar? Did you know he was from Chicago?
no, I did not. But I did meet him at Ayuka because at the foundation day of Ayuka, he was the one who inaugurated the auditorium there, and there is an auditorium by his name.
Oh, wow.
So I did meet him there then.
Tell me about when you first arrived in Pasadena.
Hmm. Well, first arrived was when I was going to Chile, which is not what you're saying. I think
Right,
you're
right.
saying
For the
as a
postdoc.
postdoc.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, it was interesting. So I came with my wife, and our son was 4 years old at the time, and we landed here. So I can go into slightly a story unrelated to science. So we were in Mumbai, ready to come to Los Angeles. Our flight was via Zurich, and this was the first flight for my son, who was 4 years old, but also the first international flight for my wife. And we're standing in the queue, and then there are these people going around the agents, and someone's is looking at the passports. And when they see our passport, he shouts to someone else, "Hey, the Mahabls are here!" And we didn't know what was happening. So it turns out that the flight we were on was delayed, and so they put us through another flight, and they actually gave us business class up to Zurich, right? And this is the first international flight, and we got into it. And then the rest of the journey was ordinary class. So my wife thought, "Oh, this is fantastic. This is how airplane travel is." And then you go into your ordinary class after that, right? So when we came here, at the time, astronomy department used to have a beautiful three-bedroom house. And so we were stationed there for a few days until we could find our own place. And at the same time, there was another postdoc who happens to be visiting here right now, actually, Fabian Walters. He also was there. And so it was a beautiful house on San Pasqual Street in Pasadena. It's a lovely area. And then the next day, George comes and gives us two bikes for a few days, which we could use until we find out what other means we could use. I didn't drive at the time, neither did my wife, and we had to get our licenses here. And 2 days later, I went to Palomar, so observing it immediately after coming here. That was also fun. So everything was happening quickly. Yeah.
What was George working on when you first connected?
So digitized Palomar Observatory Sky Survey. The Sky Survey from Palomar, this is the second sky survey using plates that had taken place, and he and the small team were working on converting them to digitized versions so that one can study them very easily using computers rather than the old ways where you would keep on using the digitized plates and writing down numbers from them and so on. The main thing that was being done was the entire Northern Sky Survey was being digitized in this way. So there were a few thousand exabyte tapes, several exabyte readers, and then those there was a pipeline going from the raw exabyte to the first processed version, the second processed version, converting that into catalogs, doing things like star galaxy classifications and so on. So very cutting edge things at the time, because we would use things like decision trees and um, many similar algorithms to go from those initial non-digitized versions to digitized versions to numerical catalogs. That was the main area. That was the main work that was being done. And of course, once you convert these, then using the catalogs to start looking for interesting objects in those. So one of the early project that we were doing was trying to look for quasars using colors in that. So the JFN were the three photographic emulsions that we had. Those were being converted to GRI. Those were the nearby filters. And then in that space, the G minus R versus R minus I, stars form a particular locus, whereas some of the high redshift quasars, a particular redshift range, they form a locus that is away from the stellar locus. So looking for objects in that area, making sure that they are not artifacts, and then taking spectra from Palomar. So that was one of the pipelines that we had, for instance.
Ashish, in our first conversation, we talked about, in broad historical terms, the development of data driven astronomy. When you first arrived at Caltech, where was it in that development?
I wasn't really much aware of all these things until I came here, because my study earlier for the thesis had been relatively small data sets. I knew about places like CDS and NED. I had used them extensively in my thesis. So I knew that there were data collections of this kind, and that NED and even SIMBAD, so NED for galaxies and SIMBAD for stars. So I knew that people were collecting data sets from different locations and putting them together. But these were not really data driven in the same sense that we could talk about today. So there were these collections, and you could query the collections, and you could get things out, and then you could write programs to associate them with each other. But around the same time that I came here, there was also the discussion about putting things together to form, to more formalize combining such elements of large data sets. And that is how, for instance, the first virtual observatory was born. I think it was in the year 2000. So just 2000 or 2001. So just 1 year after I came here, that we had the first virtual observatory meeting at Caltech. It was a formal formulation of that concept. And then for several years, there were many things in which I participated and got to know more and more about all the things that were happening and can be done and contributing to those, essentially.
Ashish, what were some of the big questions or opportunities in those early discussions that compelled people to create this virtual observatory?
Right. One of the things was that there were, if you look at different telescopes, they have different apertures and different filters. And so there's non-uniformity. In some sense, they are looking at different aspects of the universe, different aspects of specific types of stars and galaxies in that way. And being able to combine them, one would be able to go to a much higher level. Like each of these is a dimension, and each observatory has contributions in a part of this high dimensional space, and being able to combine those using these different observatories is going to help us answer many different questions. So that's the area that one wanted to go to, but also combining information that is in images and catalogs and understanding what are the gaps. That is a critical thing, because with each of the telescope you do something. By combining them you can do more, but where is it that we cannot reach by combining those as well, and how is it that we can rectify that situation? That leads to newer questions, newer instrumentation, newer projects. So that is where things one wanted to go. And also, when people take data, they are the curators, they are the best people to disseminate information about them, about the data sets. But how to abstract that information so that others can use it more easily was also a question that was being talked about. So, interoperability. And we talk about open science a lot these days, but at that time, those were sort of nascent concepts. But those VO, you can say, in some sense, was rough going in that direction of open science. So how to democratize science, how to make data access available to everybody, and that would be good for everybody because you're getting much more than what you're putting in that way.
Were the discussions exclusively centered at Caltech? Were there other astronomers or institutions involved?
Oh, yeah, it was a US thing. So there were many, many other places too. Caltech did take a leading role, but there was Johns Hopkins, Alex Zelle, SDSS, that was a big player at that time. And already there were discussions, possibilities of much larger telescopes and much larger surveys. So there were interest from NOAO, for instance, Tucson, and then University of Washington. So there were lots of different players. And there was some interest from international organizations, so not organizations, but institutions also.
Who at Caltech took a leading role in the virtual observatory project?
So George Orgowski, Tom Prince, those were two names that I can mention, but there were many other professors who were also indicated that they would be that it was generally seen to be a good thing.
Administratively, it's virtual, of course, but what were the questions about where VO could be headquartered or centered?
Right. So that's I don't remember all the details of that, but there was quite some discussion in that. So it was going to be distributed. So it was not thought that we will have just one location where we will bring all the data together. I think that was quite clear in terms of not wanting to do that in one place. Though there were some people did think that that would be one way of going, that you bring all the data together, but then the question would be how to take it from there to wherever you need. But in this distributed sense, then again the emphasis was on software, how do you write programs that allow you to access things, and also interoperability. So when I said earlier that people who take data are the best curators for that, that is why we don't want to be moving the data too much from them, because they can do things well. So if you had three different data sets that were to come together, let's say there is Chandra, which is at Harvard Smithsonian, and Ned had something here, and SDSS had something at some location. That we don't want to bring them all together, but we do want methodology that can access all of those. So being able to put an interface that will allow us to connect to whatever is behind that and pull whatever bits are needed from that. So it is mainly that was being thought about. And so it was going to be a fluid, a distributed thing which will live in cyberspace, and you can connect it from your computer, be able to log in. One could have an account that was made in a central place. So that was one thing that was discussed, and these things also existed. But then from there, you would route to different locations, and from there, bring small bits for your own working around with those data sets, putting them together, etc.
Ashish, what were some of the advances in computation itself that compelled the field to say we really need to change things up at this point?
So I think one of the big things that was happening was a database or developments in databases, how you could have many diverse tables and being able to combine them in meaningful ways, being able to sort them. And so, for instance, number of columns were growing. If you have a data set, then number of rows, there's one scalability. So you have more objects of a given type. But when you have more measurements for the same object, the complexities increase. So if I had a table from, let's say, optical observations and another table from near infrared observations, and I wanted to combine them, then the resolution of the two telescopes is different. The filters are slightly different. So when I try to combine them, how exactly I do that? And so methodology for that was being developed, and that was clearly something that not everyone can do. These are, even now, that these are hard questions. They have become simpler with some of our techniques that have been developed, etc. But at that time, people had to think, astronomers had to think right from scratch as to how we'll go about doing these things like cross matching, and the developments that were happening in the databases. That was one of the main things that enabled bringing these data together.
The question, in astronomy, what the field knows it doesn't know, just looking up at the sky, observations. Was there anything specific? Were there any big question marks in astronomy that compelled people to take a more computational approach to help answer those unknown questions?
So there wasn't only one kind of question, right? Meaning there has always been an interplay in observational astronomy, cosmology, where it's more driving towards theoretical things and going to high redshift objects, also simulations. So each of these was driving the other. Let's take, for instance, things like Sloan or the Rubin and so on. So they're interested in cosmology, understanding things like lensing or the distribution of galaxies as we go farther and farther out. So supernovae, how far can we see supernovae type 1a? Is the frequency or relative frequency of supernovae 1a with respect to other supernovae the same as we go to galaxies that are farther out, or the color evolution of these galaxies? So there were many, many different questions. And for each of these questions, the kind of observations that one may need would be slightly different. But then sky surveys were one way of answering many of these questions. And then what you could not clearly answer, or where you did not have enough observations, you would try to simulate things, try to understand those things to simulations. Now there are also emulators, of course. So what would happen is that each of them was pushing the other in different ways, and there was not one set of questions. I mentioned earlier, for instance, that we were looking at the high redshift quasars with the DPOS data. But then when we started looking at these, we started seeing that there is another group of objects that are not part of the stellar locus, but they don't overlap with the high redshift quasars either. And these were the type 2 quasars, which had different, the their emission lines were different from that, and they occupied a slightly different area in the plate. So we could go after them as a population. So when you start finding outliers, then that starts driving both how you do your observational work. In this case, it was not new observations necessarily that we were doing in terms of getting data for those, but we were taking spectra for those with the 5 meter telescope at Palomar. And so, but that also drove things to understanding how it is that why are these occupying this area, so what are the emission lines that are putting them in there, and then because of these one could also go and do polarization studies of those. So we would go and observe some of these at the Keck telescopes, and then so both theory and observations would drive each other in that way.
Once the virtual observatory was up and running, how did that change things? What new possibilities did it make possible?
So more people could access the data, and they could come in and uh, look at different kinds of things that were happening. But what I think happened mainly is some of the basic things like the cross matching services, etc., that we have made available. People could now use them in a more efficient way rather than having to have all the software on their own computers. Rather than having to get data themselves, they could log in here and be able to pull up some programs and be able to do the cross match. So I think what ended up happening is that a few algorithms became more transparent to people, and they became more user friendly, and they got utilized more in astronomy. People got to know about more data sets, their accessibility more easily. And so in general, while the view itself may not always get very good remarks from some astronomers, that is because the initial expectation that was created by VIO was very large, and many people think that it was not met. But at the same time, what VIO enabled got ingrained a lot in day-to-day astronomy that everybody does. So when something becomes ingrained and invisible, you forget that that has come from somewhere also, and you feel that it has always been there. So I think that is what happened to big data astronomy in some sense, that more people started using it without really realizing it.
What about the idea of citizen astronomy, getting more people, outside of the academy involved? Did that impact things also?
So do you mean citizen science?
I mean, backyard astronomers, people that were interested in astronomy, but they were not professional astronomers.
Right.
Was access to this data useful for the science as well?
Yeah, so anybody could go in, get an account, and be able to get that. But then it is only a handful of people who are enthusiasts like this will go and do things on their own. If, on the other hand, there are specific programs that are set up and they're told, oh, you can contribute to this or you can participate in that, then there are more people who are enthusiastic about it, get in and try to do that. Because otherwise, many times, many of the enthusiasts are mainly interested in, not mainly, that would be not the right wording, but many of them are interested in seeing beautiful pictures or seeing images, etc. When it comes to doing things, if they're told what to do, then they can come and contribute and help more easily.
Ashish, how long was your postdoc appointment for?
The initial postdoc appointment was for a period of 1 year when I came, and then it got extended for one more year, and that is where we that's around the time when we found the postdoc association here. Actually, I was one of the founder members of the postdoc association at
Oh,
Caltech.
I don't know about that. What is the postdoc association?
So there's a group now. The postdoc association has some rights, and they meet regularly. They get various speakers from outside and all that, but no such thing existed at the time, and all talks were completely on their own. And so one of the things that we said is that when you come in here, you don't know the person, so giving them a 1 year appointment is fine. But after that, Caltech used to give only 1 year extensions at a time. So you'd get a second 1 year and then a third 1 year. So if you already know this person who has come in, then you should give him or her 2 straight years after that, because otherwise you spend a lot of time thinking about whether it's going to happen, then the visa process, and then there are issues of going in and out and so on. So that was one of the things that we talked about and got sorted. But okay, to answer your question, it was a 1 year appointment, and I got an extension for another 1 year and then one more year. That's how
And
it
then do you have
happened.
a clear memory of when you decided, just on a personal level, that you and your family wanted to stay here to make this more of a long-term proposition?
So actually, it was starting to become more and more a home because my wife got a job here several months after in the very first year, and also in the astronomy department as a system administrator. And then uh, it was becoming more attractive in terms of the different tools that are available here, different telescopes that one has access to, and data set and people and everything. So I would say there was no one clear point. I did consider, well, I didn't apply anywhere formally, but whether I should go back to India, think about it, and so on. There was a time, for instance, when Ayuka was getting more interested in the 30-meter telescope, and went and spent a few months there. That was years later, of course, but I went and spent a few months considering whether I should be moving back, taking a position, working with TMT, and so on. And then TMT itself had some issues, and so that never went through. So uh, there was no specific time when that happened, but I was comfortable here, and that's how.
And the point of transition beyond your postdoc, what was your research at that point? What were you focused on?
So initially, it was the digitized Palomar Observatory Sky Survey, looking at the quasars of different types, etc. But in general, the variability, and that is when I got interested in variability as a function of time. So DPOS, I don't know if we talked about it last time, but we did not. So DPOS has these photographic plates that are 6.5 degrees wide, and so the centers are 5 degrees apart when photographic plates are taken. So there is a small strip where that overlaps between the two plates. So we have got 1.5 degree wide strips and three different emulsions. So using those 6 points, we started looking for variability in that, and we found different kinds of objects, etc. So that was very interesting because no one had done something like that before. And then after DPOS, when we decided to do the Palomar Quest survey, that is again an area where there was variability that was involved. So that is what was driving my science. So simultaneously doing uh, algorithmic development and computation related developments on all these data sets.
What were some of the big findings coming out of Palomar at that point?
So from Palomar in general,
And specifically related to what you were doing?
right. So we were able to find these redshift, lots and lots of redshift 4 quasars, of course, but we were also able to find these type 2 quasars, and then we started finding some high redshift quasars by combining data sets from here and there. We did a lot of polarization studies. And then because this was a data set, there were many outliers that were being found. So we started connecting to different groups, but it was mainly in these AGN and quasars related space that I worked a little bit. I didn't get too much involved in other kinds of variables at the time.
Were you involved in the creation of getting Palomar Transient Factory up and running in 2009?
No, I was not directly involved in the early part of PTF because at the time I was working on CRTS, the other survey from Arizona, for which we were getting data directly and doing lots of things here. So again, for CRTS, I wrote a lot of automation related things, classification related things, pipelines, etc. So each of these surveys was one step of an improvement in some sense from what we were doing before in terms of automation and real-time responses, etc. And PTF was starting at the same time. I did help a little bit with some aspects, but it was later on in PTF,
Would
not
you
right.
say that PTF was the major observational project that really demonstrated the power of computation and machine learning in astronomy?
I don't think so. It was not on its own. And PTF definitely came after what we had done with Palomar Quest, and we're doing simultaneously with CRTS. What Palomar Transient Factory did is it showed that if you can do something on an industrial level, you have one objective and be able to churn out those kinds of things in a very methodical way. So in that sense, PDF was good. But again, partly because it had one objective, that let's find these kinds of objects really well. They did that well.
What were some of the most significant findings that came out of PTF?
PDF, it was mostly explosive events, right? And so there was the diagram where you can show the time scales of events and how many of those are found at different energies. So that used to have some gaps before. And using PTF, they were able to find objects that filled some of those gaps. So improving our understanding of that. So gap transients, as those are called.
Did PTF have a relatively short lifespan? Was it intended for it to go on longer than it did?
So PTF originally, I don't remember the exact duration. It was either 3 years or
Yeah, I
5 years.
believe it was 2009 to 2012.
And then there was the IPTF, intermediate PTF. So that was the extension that went on. So at that time, I think already ZTF was planned, but it took more time for the CCDs or the focal plane to be put together using the CCDs, in general, the camera development for CTF. And so it was good that IPTF could continue during that time. I think 2014 is when ZTF started, maybe. Yeah, so 12 to 14 may have been IPTF then.
Did you have opportunity to work with Sri Kulkarni at all?
Yeah, so with ZTF, I've been doing that. As I said, with PTF, I did a little bit, but not really extensively. With ZTF, I have been leading the machine learning for ZTF. So during that time, I have been working with Sri in that sense.
Now, with the intermediate PTF, what was intermediate about it? What was improved?
I think that's a good question. I don't think I have an exact answer for that. Yeah, I think PTF was starting to approach CTF, but was not CTF yet. I don't know if it was the new CCDs that did. No, I think the CCDs were the same as before. I'm not sure.
And then what were the considerations for getting Zwicky up and running?
Right. So it was going to have a much bigger field of view. So PTF had only 8 CCDs, whereas ZTF had 16 bigger CCDs. So what was done is that the entire focal plane was now covered with DPOS, the area that was covered, even more was being covered with ZTF now, and 1 arc second pixels and better everything. I think even the focal plane, it was replaned. And then there's a robotic arm that is put in that was going to do the GR filters and for partnership also the I filter.
Now, the bigger plane of view, is that to suggest that there are technological advances in the CCDs or there's just simply more of them?
So in this case, there are more CCDs, but the way one has to do is that one has to be able to jet them close enough together so there are no large gaps. Plus, also, when you go to the edge of the field, there is vignetting that happens at the edge of the field. So you don't get the same quality of light at the edges. And there are correctors used to make sure that you can get as good a light as possible. And then post fact during the pipeline, you do additional corrections to make sure that you are recovering what you may have lost because the pixels were at one of the edge of the field of view.
And what is the impact on the amount of data that the facility is producing? Is it double simply by doubling the CCDs?
Yeah, if you simply double the CCDs, it will double. Yes. But that's only for the raw data because then you also have to add a factor for the processed amount of data and the various cross things that you do with that. And so to compare that, I think with Palomar Quest, we used to get 50 gigabyte a night maybe, and with ZTF, it's 1.4 terabytes, so an order of magnitude more.
The designation leading the machine learning effort for ZTF, what does that look like? What are your responsibilities?
So even in machine learning, there are many different aspects. The two broad aspects are that one is related to making sure that the objects that one is getting does not include artifacts. And the other is the good objects that one is getting, being able to do different things with that. So the first thing where we want to make sure that there are no artifacts, there is the real bogus classifier that we have for objects that are point-like. And then there is the streak classifier for nearby asteroids, where we want to make sure that the streaks that we see are because of an asteroid rather than a satellite. So the algorithms that do those two separations are one main aspect. And then the second aspect is where Then you look at star galaxy classification, or when you have these supernovae being classified, transients being classified, then being able to understand their nature, being able to decide which ones of those should be sent to a larger telescope for observation, etc. So those are the very, very broadly speaking. And then one also tries to keep on pushing the envelope. So for instance, you have now identified stars as stars and then identified variables among those, but what kinds of variables are those? So running programs uh, for that particular thing, subdividing variables into different subclasses. But then also there are newer and newer techniques coming in all the time. So understanding how you could use those, how you could apply those, what is it that you could do faster, or even the earlier models that have been built, updating those models so they become more efficient. So one of the first things that happens is that try to reduce the amount of time that people spend in looking for bogus objects, making sure that they don't have visibility of bogus objects that are there, and then going to all these other things. So at one of the meetings, I think it was the last ZTF team meeting, one of the supernova researchers made a statement that the real bogus classification these days is really good. We don't get any bogus objects in our stream these days. And I was alarmed by that because that's not a good thing to hear. That's a good thing to hear that there's no bogus object, but it's a bad thing to hear that there's no bogus object, because
Yeah.
what that means is that maybe we are also throwing out some good objects, right? And so what needs to happen is that when you have a certain confidence limit, if you put a threshold somewhere, then there are false positives and false negatives. We don't want any false positives, but we try to minimize false negatives also. False negatives are the objects which are real but are not being called real. And so if you put a threshold very high, then everything you are getting is pure, but then there may be an area here where you are missing out a few. And so the ideal thing to do is to have two thresholds. You get a pure thing, but also look at the difference between the smaller threshold and the bigger threshold so that you can keep on sampling it to make sure that you can keep on excluding the false positives there, but whatever real objects are there, you can push it on the other side. So those are the kinds of things that one needs to keep an eye on.
I wonder if you can explain in some technical detail managing the machine learning operations for ZTF. What's the mode of, the machine learning suggests something interesting? How do you translate that into focus on that signal and additional observation with higher resolution instruments?
Right. So again, there are different sub teams within ZTF, and depends from one team to another how they're going to take it. But in case of supernova, for instance, if you find one of the focus that some of the supernova people have is finding them as early as possible. And what that means is that you typically have a stellar explosion, and so its brightness really, really increases. So you see that it has a peak and then it starts going down. But you're not doing these observations continuously. You have sporadic observations. And so in the old days, typically supernovae would be found a few days after the peak. But because now we are very good at automating many of these methods, and we have been able to push it before so that routinely we find supernovae before the peak has been reached. So because we have multiple filters, G and R filters, and many other things, what one can do is that by using that information, be able to say roughly what the character of the object is. So classification is a stronger word, being able to put it in the class, but characterization is where you do kind of say this likely to be this, and you attach some kind of confidence to that. So it is based on these things that you can then start putting them into different areas. And so one of the machine learning things that we do is for supernova classification. So there's the ACDM machine that we have, spectral energy distribution machine, which is at the 1.5 meter telescope. So from a 1.2 meter telescope, you get these objects, you characterize them early on, and then a small number of them you can take spectra of, low resolution spectra of. So we have a machine learning algorithm now which classifies those automatically and then registers them with the TNS, the transient naming server. And so trying to keep on pushing that, improving that. So you separate type 1A and non 1A. The type 1A get to their own area because you can do various things with that. But the non-type 1A, what those are, there are other researchers who are interested in that. So we try to classify them better using machine learning, but then we quickly discovered that we don't have enough numbers for that to do it automatically with the small number of points we have in their light curves. So we started looking for other things, and we soon realized that if we concentrated on whether they are hydrogen rich or there is more helium in them, then that classification is simpler. So trying to understand what kind of questions you could direct yourself towards based on the data available, that becomes possible as you start addressing these questions. So that's one example how we wanted to do one thing, but the data indicated that we should be asking a slightly different question, and that's where we've been pushing on now.
And then how do you determine what higher resolution instrument to send this signal to?
It's generally a choice that gets defined to you by what is available in terms of where the spectroscopes are, what time of day it is at different places. So growth network is one of the networks that I could say where they've been trying to follow things like, say, objects, kilonovae, and so on. So there are many telescopes that are around the globe in different locations. And then when you have these objects, then you again how bright they are, what spectroscope is available, and what time zone it is. That will determine a smaller number of sets that will allow you to. So even for that, for instance, there is very basic kind of machine learning. It's not really machine learning that you can do, but something akin to scheduling. So how for instance the ZTF observations are scheduled. There are so many hundreds of fields that are going to be observed by ZTF. And then you have a certain cadence with which you want to observe those. And so many have been observed n times, m times, k times, whatever. And so at the start of the night, the automated scheduler now goes and decides how the observations are going to happen. And then if a TO, an interrupt comes along, how that would change and how you could go back up. So similarly, there are schedulers which look at these observations and then be able to say, okay, for this object, we want this depth because of its brightness. So many telescopes are available. Only these have spectra. These are in the correct time or not. And that is how you can do that, do the scheduling for those.
I wonder if you can point to a specific example throughout the process. There's the survey, there's the machine learning, you're alerted to something interesting, you send this on to another telescope. What's an example of something that we've learned in astronomy that almost certainly would have been missed absent this process?
Well, so gravitational waves would be a great example of that. So LIGO detected a transient, and then it sends out an alert of a very large area, several tens of square degrees. And then immediately there are so many listeners who are listening to exactly those kinds of things. So their observatories get triggered. And this is a slightly different case because we don't know the identity of the object. And so what these telescopes then do is that they scour the sky in that area, both new observations because you want to see what the object is doing now, but to compare that with looking at old reference images and doing these comparisons, then you come to a few objects that are likely the counterparts. And then you do all kinds of things like more observations and simultaneously reasoning and theory as to which ones of them cannot be or which ones are likely to be. And then you come down and pinpoint on things. So these are the discoveries that wouldn't have happened, mergers that are optical counterparts to these gravitational wave observations without such a thing existing, because there is extensive machine learning that is happening even in that.
So, with the detection of gravitational waves in 2015, did you see this really as a triumph of machine learning?
Yes, there was definitely a lot of machine learning at various different stages that was involved in that.
Were you involved at all in the LIGO collaboration?
Well, I was involved in the LIGO collaboration very broadly speaking. I have been using some of that, but I was not doing anything with respect to these detections or the follow-up of that.
Given the excitement, the Nobel Prize, in what ways did the detection of gravitational waves really put machine learning on the map for astronomy?
Well, I don't think anyone looked at it as something putting machine learning on the map, really, because the gravitational waves had been heralded. They had also been indirectly been observed, and this was an indication of that really. And then machine learning, though it did play a major role, it was still tiny compared to this entire new window opening up because of these gravitational waves and detections of that. But definitely it was always there at some level. Right?
But to be clear, I mean, it's a counterfactual, you can never know. But absent machine learning, it's quite possible that we would have missed those signals.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
Ashish, I'm curious, just either intellectually or scientifically, what level of overlap is there between your responsibilities for machine learning at ZTF and your work at the Center for Data Driven Discovery?
Oh, there's a lot. So because I'm primarily interested in data related things, and machine learning uses a lot of data. So that's really the currency. Data is the currency for that. And so I'm always on the lookout within ZTF for different areas in which I can apply machine learning, and same is true elsewhere. So for instance, the methodology transfer that I do through CD cube to early detection of cancer. So there are so many parallels again that happen there. I'm looking even the data types, for instance, in ZTF we have catalogs and images which we use for machine learning. Similarly, in other areas, that's the same. So trying to think back and forth between the two always happens, and more or less transparently. So abstraction of the data, that is something where I really emphasize a lot to people that yes, you take data from an instrument. The scientist is very important and critical, that's there. But how do we abstract the data so that we can do more in an automated way? And then when it comes back to doing decisions about what we have found, then make sure that the domain expert is there. So there are quite a few parallels between the two, happens all the time.
Ashish, what institutional relationships do you have with IPAC?
Well, IPAC maintains all of ZTF data. And so the IPAC members are on the machine learning meetings, they're on the ZTF meeting. So I have discussions with them all the time, or the solar system related data from ZTF, etc. So that's the relationship that I have. I have not had anything specific other than that for some time. I talk to many of the people there all the time.
And is your relationship with JPL's data science group, is that through IPAC or that's separate?
That's separate.
What is that? What is the data science group at JPL?
So the data science group at JPL, they have a working group and they do lots of things there about all kinds of things related to JPL. Actually, there's spacecraft autonomy, but they also have things related to the cancer-related work that I mentioned. For instance, is about organizing the data for the National Cancer Institute, and so I'm involved with those. But there are also other initiatives. Like just today, I had a meeting where we were discussing how they have organized some papers from Cassini and Titan and so on into a knowledge base, and that knowledge base can be questioned to essentially seek out resources that are in the database, how we could extend that to other areas, including for cancer bioinformatics and so on. So somewhat like ChatGPT, but not at the same level, but being able to question it and then retrieve essentially different data sets. So then there's also the essentially the planetary science data group there. So they have lots of things happening with planetary data sets, and I have been liaising with them on a few things as well.
One of the most exciting areas, of course, in astronomy right now is exoplanet research. What opportunities do you see in learning about exoplanets from a machine learning perspective?
Oh, again, machine learning has been used very extensively in exoplanet detection. So, for instance, with exoplanets, so with Kepler, we found several, and right now the main machine that has been finding exoplanets is TESS, and TESS has very large pixels. But the fantastic thing with TESS is that it has very uniform time series. And what that means is that one can apply many time series based algorithms to that, even some that we normally do not apply to the gappy time series from the rest of astronomy. And then what happens in an exoplanet or in an exoplanet detection is that the planet goes around the star and blocks the light of the star for a tiny bit. And it is those dips in the time series that algorithms can look for. And so when you find these dips, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's an exoplanet because there are many other possibilities why there could be a dip. For instance, there could be binary stars, two stars going around each other. That's the commonest example. But there can be variables where you can find dips because of the, just like sunspots, there can be star spots, and those star spots can cause that. So there are a few different ways in that. And so we used a machine learning algorithm, for instance, with test data to look for possible exoplanet candidates. So you have these dips that happen. You create a training set with from known examples, which one of these are binaries, which one of these are actual exoplanet candidates, and which one of these are junk or whatnot, and then train that algorithm with that. And then you unleash it on a much larger set of light curves, and then it gives you back your exoplanet candidates. That's one of the simplest things that is there, but there are also more advanced ones. Like, again, because the test pixels are so large, once you have found exoplanet candidates, you need to compare that with other data sets to make sure that you are finding the right thing. One of the things that is then done is compare it with Gaia dataset, which has exquisite astrometry, to see if there are likely to be binaries in that dataset and exclude it that way. So the time series itself doesn't tell you, but combine it with Gaia data, and then it tells you that it is something different.
On the all exciting question of detecting biosignatures or even technosignatures in exoplanets, what role
Mhm.
do you see machine learning playing?
Again, a huge role, because there too, what's going to happen is that how do you define a technosignature? That is one interesting question. There are many, many different ways. And then how do you determine if something is a technosignature once you think you have found it is another question. So in most of these cases, what is critical to say is that there should be a null hypothesis, assumption that there's no technosignature, and then be able to discount many other things before you can say, oh, because we have eliminated this, this looks like a technosignature. There may be a signature which is really, really obvious, but in most cases, it's really subtle. And almost all the cases so far have been where we have been able to explain it away with something. So you could find a light curve, for instance, where you've got certain dips, and then the dips have certain patterns. So it could be because of something like a Dyson sphere, for instance, where you have the civilization that has built intricate things around their star or their planet, which is what is blocking the stellar light. But before you say that that is what it is, you should be able to eliminate other possibilities like the changes in the star itself, or there being debris that is causing that, rather than a structure that beings there have built, right? And so all this needs quite intricate machine learning to be able to tell apart, because the signals that we have are going to be fragmentary mostly, just because of the nature of how observations are done.
Ashish, what about much closer to home in our own solar system? Looking for for life on the icy moons, even signs of extant life on Mars. Where do you see machine learning contributing?
Again, everywhere. So, for instance, when we visit nearby moons or other planets, what needs to happen is that we there will be cameras that will be looking at these bodies and that will be trying to look for life. This is from a distance first. And then the comparison is going to be done with models that we have on Earth using large data sets that we have gathered. How does life look like? What are the telltale signatures of life, both visually and in terms of motions when we have images, etc. So those are the models that we will start with, even when these uh, algorithms, along with the compute infrastructure, go to distant planets, and they will be looking at things there. So that will again form the very basis of how things are. And then once we start learning more from there, that will improve our training samples locally. So there are these things like generative adversarial networks, which try to generate new images and then compare it with what have been naturally seen to try to attach significance to those. So that is where, again, when we get real footage from many of those bodies, that can be incorporated in our training sets to improve that.
Ashish, moving our conversation closer to the present. When the COVID pandemic hit and everybody was remote, did you feel well positioned just by nature of what you do that you were able to keep up operations remotely?
Yes. So The Palomar Observatory, for instance, had been closed for a small amount of time, but it's a very isolated place. So it was very easy to say that people who are there should be there. And so all the visitations from here had stopped there. So that had continued. And in terms of the day-to-day thing that we did, so Caltech also was fairly good about how to isolate things. We could work from home, come here, and so the travel had stopped, of course. So there were no conferences for a long time. In fact, I came back from Puerto Rico in March, and then I think it was 1 or 2 days later that LA shut down. That no more travel, well, not no more travel, but in general, the lockdown that we had, shutdown kind of thing that we had at the time. But apart from travel, the other things continued. In fact, one thing that happened during that time because of the pandemic is number of meetings went up because everyone was
Right.
home all the time. No one could say, "Well, I'm in travel, I can't attend this meeting." But that changed definitely in the other direction.
And just to move it right up to the present, what are you currently working on, besides, of course, the proposal?
Yeah, I think ZTF Zarth that I may or may not have mentioned
I don't
last
think so,
time.
no.
This is a game that we are developing initially for
Oh, is
outreach.
this what you showed me on your phone?
Yes.
Yes.
So initially for outreach, but we'd like to extend it for citizen science also. So what we do is that nightly about 100 transients that we find from ZTF we put on the phone. So this is an extension of the SkyMap app. SkyMap is an app which you point to the sky, then you see the sky that is behind on the phone. So you can identify constellations and planets, etc. What we have managed to do is that put an extra layer on that of transients from ZTF. So there, right now we have four different kinds of transients and four different colors. So as you move your phone around, if there is a transient in a particular direction, you'll be able to see it there. And when you touch it, you get some metadata about that object, like what is its nature, how bright it is, what its location is numerically, etc. But then also the exciting feature that we are doing is that you can catch it like, so we are doing it like Pokemon Go, but for transients. So you can catch the object and then it will show you more metadata as to how rare it is, and then are there other objects of that type, etc. Various things, and then you can have a collection of it, etc.
And is ZTF going strong? Are there plans for upgrades or for a new instrument at Palomar?
So ZTF, we are currently in ZTF phase two because the first 3 year survey or 5 year, first 5 year survey was done, and it's the second 3 year thing that's going on. But we will be finishing officially around September this year, and then there may be a small extension from NSF to that. And then we are also thinking of something like ZTF3. We may change the cadence a little bit, etc. It's all in the air right now, but very likely something will happen. So LSST, which is LSST Rubin, which from the southern hemisphere will be the bigger telescope that will take a lot of data. Its start date has been pushed back a little bit for various reasons, and astronomy community would definitely want a survey like ZTF to continue at least until the time that Rubin starts, because many of the brokers are currently using ZTF data to classify their classify the ZTF objects, but build in general the infrastructure for LSST/Rubin. Not having anything would not be a good thing for them.
So to be clear, ZTF has utility even when Rubin is up and running. It still
Oh,
has it's
absolutely.
yeah.
Also because ZTF is in the north and Rubin is in the south, so there's also that issue. So there will be a small overlap region. It will be good in itself because you can be observing at different times, but also because we'll be covering some parts that LSST will not be looking at.
Ashish, when Astro 2020 came out, the decadal report from the National Academy, what were some of the most important takeaways for you? What was its approach to machine learning, for example?
Well, machine learning was not really as highlighted as I would have liked. There could have been much more there because it is encompassing everything. And I think partly the reason could also be because machine learning is so ingrained, somewhat like the VO tools that I mentioned,
Yeah.
that people don't see as an obvious thing that you should highlight or that you should say that this is important. Because in machine learning, there are so many things. For instance, if you don't have a good training set, machine learning is generally useless, meaning there are ways in which you can do unsupervised learning, clustering, etc. But a majority of machine learning that happens in astronomy is supervised, where you need a good training set. And unless you have a good training set, then you are not going to get good answers out. So that's where we can talk about trash in, trash out kind of thing, right? So you need to make these good sets. And to make these good sets, you need to be able to invest in that. And I think from that point of view, it's very critical that astronomy keeps up to date with all the data science things and investing in more machine learning.
Do you think for Astro 2030 to really look to the future, will machine learning be so deeply ingrained that it's going to be unavoidable to treat it more fulsomely than previously?
I think so. Because if you again take examples like ChatGPT, which suddenly sprung upon people. So ChatGPT is not general AI. It is not there. It is not even close to how humans are, but it is so much better than anything that has existed before. So I can think of calling it as four different levels. One thing is all the other programs at one level, ChatGPT above it, we above it, and general AI above it. And so what's starting to happen is that there are many things that are starting to go at least to the level of ChatGPT. And even achieving that level would be a very good thing compared to everything else was way down there at the floor. And so by 2030, which is several years away still, I'm sure there'll be huge developments that will happen where you'll see far more machine learning, more than machine learning, artificial intelligence, really, right? Because machine learning more talks about this training aspect, whereas artificial intelligence at the name suggests that it's being able to connect more dots together in more automated fashion. So we are going to be seeing more of that.
Ashish, you mentioned that your involvement in the 30-meter telescope goes back quite a ways. The saga continues. If it does get built, what will that mean for you?
Again, 30-meter telescope, because of its large mirror, is going to be able to get very high resolution observations for fairly faint objects. And what that means is that many things that we find with our bigger surveys will be capable of actually resolving what they are using spectroscopy, one of the modes, for instance. So right now, not having very large telescopes means that for fainter objects, we may need to rely on machine learning to tell us what they are, which is fine if we can extend our machine learning quite well. But with something like TMT, you can get exquisite actual observations with some of those things. But also, you'll be able to get great imaging farther and farther in the universe, which can form newer data sets for machine learning. So it's not as if it's there only to vindicate what machine learning has been finding, but providing new targets for something like that.
Well, Ashish, now that we've worked right up to the present, for the last part of our talk, I'd like to ask a few retrospective questions about your career, then we'll end looking to the future. So I'll return first, of course, to the topic that brought us together. When did you and George and others start to recognize that the computational and machine learning impact in astronomy and then all of science was significant enough that we needed to think about it in historical terms? When did those conversations really start?
Actually, that conversation we have been having in general that it's important, but when it really solidified was with a colleague in India. I was talking to him when during my last visit about a year or so back. That so he Pranav Sharma, he's a curator and astronomer and enthusiast. So he has created this space museum in Hyderabad at the Birla Planetarium there. We were talking about the big data sets and so on, and it came out that maybe it's a good idea to be able to document these things because there are so many details. So just like we are talking now, it's all over the place, and being able to make it into a journey that people can look at it, understand what it is happening, that would be good thing. And George was, of course, we had talked about these things because he and I have been discussing big data for more than 2 decades now,
Yes.
and it comes up all the time in our astroinformatics series of conferences and so on. So in some sense, some of that history has been created here. Caltech, in fact, has been a leader in that, and so there was it was very receptive. He was very receptive to that, as were you when we talked about it, from especially from Caltech's point of view. And so the discussions had been at a level, but not in terms of wanting to do it ourselves now, which I think is a very good time. So
And when all is said and done, best case scenario, we're working hard at this for years on end. What are the outcomes for you? What do you want to see achieved?
through the history part or in general the big data part?
The entire, documenting the history of,
Yeah,
of big data. What will be
right.
accomplished as a result?
I think with the documenting, what will happen is that it will be for other people to understand what it is, but also for ourselves. The most beautiful thing that can happen is our understanding the gaps and the biases that have been in there. And so once that happens, it'll help us rectify some of those things also. So you said, for instance, that in 2020, what was there about machine learning? And I said there was nothing. So that is clearly a gap.
Yeah.
And if there is a well documented thing that documents how astronomy has been leading this and what has not happened in astronomy still, then I think that will be a good thing for future.
I'm curious, Ashish, what do you think historians will find most interesting in these developments as they think more broadly beyond the technical aspects of astronomy?
Right. So one of the things that I feel may find, just like we'll find gaps, there may be also some redundancies. So multiple groups trying to do the same thing at the same time. And so in some sense, similar outcomes coming. Whereas I'm not saying that they could have been doing different things necessarily, but if they had been collaborating, then there was a bigger whole that could have come out there. So I think first of all, people will be able to realize what beautiful work has happened. That I hope is the biggest thing that comes out when the whole picture is seen, the jigsaw is seen. But then there'll also be these gaps and redundancies that will be seen, and how whether there would be ways to improve that going forward. How do we channelize things so that money could be used in a better way and bring about goals that are combined rather than go by the vagaries of a few people or a few institutes or so on. And again, the democratization of science that has happened, all the science, because of the openness, because of the large data archives and uh, DRs, essentially data releases going to large number of places, people will see how enabling that has become and being able to take it to a new level. So NASA has been taking this approach of more open data, and again, it has not been fully implemented, but they would like to do that. And if more projects do that and we see the democratization through that, then I think that'll be great. So that's another thing that I hope people can see and we all can see. And that is what I feel. And I hope I can see that as well.
Ashish, as you survey your own career so far, what has brought you the most satisfaction, either in terms of your own discoveries in astronomy or the methodologies that you've innovated that have allowed discovery from others?
Well, I think both. I, so I see that astronomy is very fundamental to me. You asked earlier about the religious incline of my parents, and it is mainly through astronomy that I got to become an atheist, and I could see the universe as the answer, not necessarily created by anyone, but essentially a very fantastic thing which is there for us to explore. And being able to explore that is something that gives me a great amount of joy, and finding new things, understanding things we did not know before, but all the time we are getting to know and more and more. That doesn't mean we know everything or we are close enough to knowing everything. I think that is far away. That is something that we may never reach, but I don't think that matters. I would rather continue to discover things on my own and with others with me rather than being told the answers, that this is the answer and that has been told to us and we are done. I don't find that interesting. Finding answers to questions that we may pose or others help pose for us is what is, I think, an interesting journey. And maybe that's through algorithm or through data or through astronomy or through cancer research, whatever. And in fact, one of the things that I do is that I also write science fiction,
Oh,
and I try to
really?
take some of these aspects into that. So one of my, I've been writing, I have published in Marathi, my mother tongue, and my book should be coming out in hopefully a couple of months actually.
Oh, wow. Will it have an English translation?
So I've been translating some of the stories myself, and the TechLit organization, which is at Caltech, I'm a member of that also. So they have been waiting some of those stories. So what I'm hoping to do is that maybe after this book is published in Marathi and I have translated all of them, maybe bring out an English version. So there is an anthology that is coming out of Caltech, stories written by Caltech and JPL authors, and that should happen in May, I believe. So one of my English stories appears in that.
I'll have to check it out. Wow. Finally, Ashish, some questions looking to the future. When we look at programs like ChatGPT, it's almost mind-boggling the level of advances in machine learning. So a few questions there. First, in the humanities, there's a lot of hand-wringing going on right now because we're getting to the point where we don't know what the computer has created or what a human has created. Are those concerns transferable in the science in terms of knowing what's true, being able to figure out what's real and what's a fake?
Well, in science, science has always dealt with being able to go to first principles if required. So we have scientists I don't know if that's the right word, but adore because of the work they have done. But it's not really something that we say that because such and such scientists have said such and such thing that we should accept that. We should be able to prove or disprove that. Anyone should be able to prove or disprove that by going to the first principle. So when someone says that, okay, this is how it is, we normally take that to be true, not because that person has said it, but because of the reputation of that person, plus the fact that we can check it if needed. Whereas with something like ChatGPT, it's very good with patterns that have been used again and again by a large number of people for a long time. Whereas if you ask it questions that are at the edge, it hallucinates hugely. So it gives answers that seem very confident and very eloquent, but wrong. So I say that for something like ChatGPT, one can ask it questions that one knows the answers to or very close to the answers. So in science, when one talks about things that may or may not be true, again, the scientific method is, I think, the key. And so long as we can continue to follow the scientific method, then one can keep on getting answers. So one may make mistakes. Science also makes mistakes, but it is something that can be corrected. And when we see a correction, we know that what was there before was wrong. So Newton's laws, for instance, of motion compared to Einstein's laws of motion are an approximation, but they're not wrong. For most practical purposes, for most things, we can use them, and the error that we get is a tiny. But on the other level, they're also wrong in the sense that they can be superseded, and we understand that. But that doesn't reduce any of the things that Newton did. So, same way for most of the science, because of the scientific method we have, then we can know what is right and wrong or whatever one is doing at that time. So following the scientific method is what I would say would be the critical thing.
Given all of the phenomenal advances in machine learning, are you at all concerned that machine learning's capabilities will outstrip our abilities in instrumentation and observation? Are there limits in the physical capacities of these instruments that machine learning will just outpace them? It'll tell us everything that's interesting, and the instruments can't keep up.
I don't think machine learning by itself is going to be able to do that because it is always going to be dependent on data. So just like as I said before, that with the current observatories which can go up to 2021 magnitudes like ZTF, we can take spectra and find out the ground truth of those objects. With machine learning, we can extrapolate it to beyond. So for instance, with LSST Rubin gets its observations, machine learning will be able to classify those objects whether or not we get spectra to a magnitude or two fainter than that. But what if we want to go even fainter? Then machine learning, the extrapolation that it can do will not really be true because there has to be improved ground truth. The training set that I talked about before, it has to improve, and that improvement will have to happen through instrumentation. or actual visits to other places, or change of point of view, or theoretical knowledge that we can bring about, and so on. So I don't think machine learning is going to be in and end into itself. We'll need other things. We'll need things that can step out of the machine learning. So machine learning is a closed world in some sense, and there are things that it won't be able to reach. So it's something like where one can talk about Gödel's theorem coming in some fashion. So some kind of incompleteness there, because you have a set of consistent set of axioms, and those consistent set of axioms, either they're powerful enough or not powerful enough. If they're not powerful enough to reach everything, then that's no good anyway. But if they're really good to encompass, then there can always be an additional axiom that you can add to it, which will take you further in that sense. So some a statement that you cannot say true or false within that machine learning thing. So there'll be things that it cannot really see as truth or not truth, and you can extend the system.
Ashish, what about the impacts of machine learning for career prospects for up and coming astronomers? I'm sure you've heard AI is now threatening jobs like pharmacists or lawyers or accountants. What about astronomers? Are you ever
Mhm.
concerned that you're contributing to the demise of the profession?
I don't think so. And even the other professions where things are going away, it is the automatic parts, the sort of lower rung parts that are really going away, not the highest ones. So human thinking is still far, far above the current automation, current AI or ML capabilities that are there. And it will be for some time, a few decades at least. But eventually, yes, meaning AI will be the next step. Meaning, I think natural evolution from unicellular to non-conscious multicellular to humans would be AI, is what I feel, and that's inevitable. And I feel that if it happens in our generation, that's so much better for us, because we'll be able to go with them and do something. So one of the things that's not going to happen, at least for a very long time, is AI getting ambition, AI trying to ask itself, why am I? Or different AIs being able to come together and do things to, say, annihilate humanity or something. So those are still science fiction things, right? Or science fantasy things, even. So there'll be better and better AIs, but they will still be expert systems. So ChatGPT is fantastic at doing various things in English, but it cannot come out of the computer and do something. So when someone loses a job, that is a real thing, and that is bad. But generally, so the way I put it is that ChatGPT is like a young person who has learned the patterns of language without learning the grammar. Now, it also knows a little bit of grammar because it has also learned the teaching of grammar in patterns in some sense. So anyone can pick up a foreign language without really learning the grammar if you have stayed with them, if you keep talking to a lot of people. So ChatGPT is something like that. And anything, human things that can be fit into that. So those are the ones that can go. But there are also other things like DALI, for instance, or stable diffusion, which can also draw pictures. Now, does that mean that artists will lose their job? Not necessarily, because there are media that DALI cannot handle. So there are various things that you can do with those. So there are always going to be things that humans will be able to do for a long time, for at least a few decades, where machine learning is not really going to replace us or take over or belittle us.
So you're saying that at least for the duration of your career, astronomy will still need astronomers.
Well, I think for a long time. Astronomy even more so. I was talking about the other things where for a few decades there will be things that you can always find things to do. With astronomy, I think, as we talked about, there's instrumentation and so on. So until we have autonomous robots building their own astronomy observatories to replace astronomers, but then that would be a fantastic day, right? Meaning if AI is trying to do astronomy.
Finally, Ashish, last question looking to the future. What are you most excited about personally? What are the prospects for discovery in astronomy made possible by machine learning?
I think just being able to do a complete census of our galaxy and thereby other galaxies, trying to understand all kinds of things that we have in our galaxies, classes and subclasses, and uh, all the details related to that. We are not quite there yet, but that's where we are going in the next few years. So even understanding all kinds of asteroids within our solar system, starting right from there, right? Because again, ZDF discovered Vatira, an asteroid inside the orbit of Venus, and we didn't think one existed, or maybe one existed. So just understanding how things are around us, and then going farther and understanding about how our neighbors are, and going all the way within our galaxy, understanding all different kinds of phenomena that are there and what's happening. I think that's fantastic.
It's exciting indeed. Ashish, it's been a great pleasure spending this time with you, and I look forward to our additional collaborations. I'd like to thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much.